Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at something that's happening in your body every second of every day. But you probably don't think about it that much, how your body regulates blood pressure.
Yeah, it's one of those things we just kind of take for granted, but it's really vital for getting oxygen and nutrients to our organs and keeping everything running smoothly.
For sure. Our source material for today's deep dive is a physiology handout from Dr. Rasha Eldeeb. And what I found really fascinating going through it is we're not just talking about like a single system here. There are actually three different levels that our bodies use to regulate blood
Yeah,
pressure.
that's right. We've got short-term, intermediate, and long-term regulations, like having a whole team of specialists working behind the scenes.
Yeah, exactly. So, let's start with those first responders, the short-term mechanisms. What makes them so important?
Well, imagine if you stand up suddenly,
Yeah.
gravity's going to pull blood away from your head, and you might feel a little lightheaded. Those short-term mechanisms kick in within seconds to counteract that drop and keep blood flowing to your brain.
So it's all about those super fast adjustments.
Precisely.
Hmm.
And the key player here is the nervous system. It's like a high-speed communication network constantly monitoring blood pressure and sending signals to adjust heart rate and blood vessel constriction.
Okay, so walk us through how this actually works in practice. Like, say my blood pressure dips suddenly. What's happening in my body?
All right, well, you've got these incredible sensors called baroreceptors located in your carotid arteries and aorta. They're like little pressure gauges constantly monitoring blood flow.
Okay, so if my blood pressure drops, these baroreceptors are like sending out an SOS signal.
Exactly. That signal shoots straight to the brain, specifically to the medulla oblongata.
The medulla oblongata.
Yeah, it's basically the brain's command center for blood pressure. It receives the signals from the baroreceptors and sends out instructions faster than you can blink.
Wow, so it's all happening incredibly quickly. What kind of instructions are we talking about? Like, what does the medulla actually tell the body to do?
Well, it analyzes the situation, figures out how low the blood pressure is, and then based on that, tells the heart to beat faster and the blood vessels to constrict. That quick action helps push blood pressure back up to a normal level.
It's like your body has its own internal paramedic, ready to jump in at a moment's notice.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
But okay, if this system is so efficient, why do we need other levels of blood pressure control?
That's a great question.
Hmm.
You see, the baroreceptor reflex is great for those quick adjustments, but it has its limitations. For one, it can kind of get tricked by chronically high blood pressure.
Meaning what? It stops working as well.
In a way, yeah, it becomes less sensitive over time, and those rapid responses aren't as effective.
So it's like those smoke detectors that go off every time you burn toast. You just start to ignore them after a while.
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy. And that's why we need these other mechanisms that kick in over longer periods to fine-tune blood pressure and make sure it stays within a healthy range.
Makes sense. Okay, so if baroreceptors are like the sprinters of blood pressure control, what other athletes are on this team?
Well, we have chemoreceptors, which are particularly sensitive to changes in blood oxygen, carbon dioxide, and pH levels.
Oh, wow. So they're monitoring the chemical composition of the blood.
Exactly. They usually play more of a supporting role, but they become crucial when blood pressure drops dangerously low, like in cases of severe blood loss or shock.
Oh, wow. So that's when they really jump into action.
Yeah.
What about those atrial reflexes mentioned in Dr. Eldeeb's handout? They sound a bit different.
Right, they are unique. You see, atrial reflexes respond mainly to changes in blood volume rather than pressure directly.
Okay, so instead of measuring how hard the blood is pushing, they're more concerned with how much blood is actually in the system.
Precisely. And a key example is the Bainbridge reflex. It's a little counterintuitive, but when the atria, those upper chambers of the heart, sense an increase in blood volume, they actually tell the heart to beat faster.
Wait, but wouldn't a slower heart rate be more efficient with more blood volume? I mean, it seems like the heart could relax a bit.
You would think so, right? But the Bainbridge reflex is really about balancing both pressure and volume. By increasing the heart rate, it makes sure that the extra blood is pumped efficiently through the circulatory system, and it prevents pressure from building up in the heart itself.
So it's kind of like a traffic management system, making sure that blood keeps moving smoothly through the highways and byways of our circulation.
Exactly. Even these seemingly small adjustments can have a big impact on how well our cardiovascular system functions.
Wow. This is already so complex, and we've only just scratched the surface of short-term regulation.
Oh, there's so much more to explore. We haven't even touched on the emergency responses yet. The CNS ischemic response and the norepinephrine vasoconstrictor mechanism.
Ooh, okay, those sound intense. What kind of situations would trigger those emergency systems?
Well, think of them as the body's last line of defense. The CNS ischemic response, for example, activates when blood flow to the brain becomes critically low, like in cases of severe blood loss. It's the brain's way of saying, hey, I need oxygen, N now W.
So it's a life-saving reflex. What actually happens in this kind of extreme situation?
It triggers a massive increase in blood pressure and heart rate. Think of it as the body pulling out all the stops to make sure the brain and other vital organs get the oxygen they need to survive.
It really makes you appreciate just how much is happening behind the scenes to keep us alive, you know?
It really does.
Okay, and what about this norepinephrine epinephrine mechanism? Is that another emergency response?
Absolutely. It's tied to our fight or flight response.
Hmm.
When we perceive a threat and our sympathetic nervous system goes into overdrive, well, it triggers the release of these really powerful hormones, norepinephrine and epinephrine.
Ah, the famous adrenaline rush.
Exactly. And they act like turbochargers for our cardiovascular system.
Yeah.
They cause blood vessels to constrict, especially in areas like the skin and digestive system, which aren't as essential in a crisis. This redirects blood flow to the muscles and heart, where it's needed most.
So they're like prioritizing where the blood needs to go. Wow, it's incredible how these short-term mechanisms can react so quickly to keep our blood pressure stable. But it sounds like they're more about handling those immediate changes, those sudden ups and downs. What happens when we need longer-term adjustments?
Well, that's where the intermediate and long-term mechanisms come in. They act more like skilled engineers, making subtle adjustments to fine-tune blood pressure over longer periods. And that's what we'll be diving into after a quick break.
All right, folks, stay tuned as we continue to explore this amazing system that keeps us going. We'll be right back to uncover the secrets of those long-term regulators. So before the break, we were talking about those short-term regulators, the first responders of blood pressure control. You were comparing them to sprinters. So if we keep with that analogy, what kind of athlete would you say this intermediate mechanism is, this capillary fluid shift?
Well, it's definitely not a sprinter. It's more like a middle distance runner, maybe.
Yeah.
Not as fast as those nervous system reflexes, but it can still cover a lot of ground. Capillary fluid shift usually takes minutes to hours to fully kick in.
Interesting. So it's slower, but steadier. Just to remind us, what are capillaries again?
Oh, capillaries. They're the tiniest blood vessels in your body, and they form this massive network that reaches pretty much every tissue. The capillaries are where all the action happens, really. It's where oxygen and nutrients get delivered to the cells and waste products get picked up.
Ah, okay. So they're like the delivery trucks of the circulatory system.
Yeah, exactly. And their walls are super thin, which allows fluid to pass back and forth between the blood and the surrounding tissues. And that's the key to this whole capillary fluid shift mechanism.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does this fluid movement affect blood pressure exactly?
Well, imagine your capillaries are like tiny little dams, and they can adjust how much fluid they hold back. So if the blood pressure inside the capillary goes up, it's like the water level rising behind a dam. That extra pressure pushes some fluid out into the surrounding tissues, which helps lower the pressure inside the vessels.
Okay, I see. And what about if the blood pressure is too low?
Well, then it's like the water level dropping behind the dam. The gates kind of close up a bit, holding on to more fluid within the capillaries, and that helps to bring the blood pressure back up.
So it's like the body has its own built-in pressure relief valve? Pretty neat.
It is. The body is amazing. But of course, sometimes we need more than just fluid shifts to regulate blood pressure. Like if there's a more significant or longer lasting change.
Right. What happens then?
Well, that's when the long-term mechanisms come into play. And this is where things get really, really interesting. We're talking about hormones that act like master conductors, orchestrating changes in blood volume and pressure over days, weeks, even longer.
Okay, so we're shifting gears here a little bit. Moving from the circulatory system to the endocrine system.
Yep, exactly. And one of the most important players in this whole hormonal orchestra is the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system, or RAS for short.
RAS. Okay, that sounds kind of complex.
It is a bit intricate, but we can break it down. Think of it like a relay race, okay?
Yeah.
So, first, the kidneys release an enzyme called renin. That's our first runner passing the baton.
Okay, so renin gets the ball rolling, as it were. What happens next?
Well, renin acts on a protein called angiotensinogen, which is made by the liver. This interaction forms angiotensin the first, our second runner in the relay.
Got it. Angiotensin I's got the baton now. Where's it headed?
To the lungs. That's where angiotensin gets converted into angiotensin II by an enzyme called ACE. This is like the crucial handoff in the race because angiotensin II is really the star athlete here.
Oh, okay. And why is angiotensin the second so important? What does it actually do?
Well, angiotensin II is a very potent vasoconstrictor. That means it causes blood vessels to narrow, which increases resistance and pushes that blood pressure up. You can kind of think of it like tightening a hose to increase the water pressure.
Ah, that makes sense. So it directly raises blood pressure, but it doesn't stop there, right?
Right. It also stimulates the release of aldosterone from the adrenal glands. And aldosterone is another key player in this whole system.
Okay, I'm sensing another handoff in this relay race. What does aldosterone do?
It acts on the kidneys, telling them to hold on to more salt and water. And that, of course, increases blood volume, which further contributes to higher blood pressure.
So it's like a two-pronged attack. Constricting those blood vessels and pumping up the volume, it's a pretty effective way to get that blood pressure back on track.
It is. It's a really effective system. And to make things even more fascinating, angiotensin II also stimulates the release of another hormone we've already touched on, vasopressin.
Wait, vasopressin, isn't that the hormone that helps us conserve water? I remember learning about that in high school biology. What does that have to do with blood pressure?
See, that's the beauty of this system. Everything's interconnected. Vasopressin plays a vital role in both fluid balance and blood pressure regulation.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. So we've got vasopressin and aldosterone both working together to fine-tune blood volume and pressure in the long term.
Exactly. Like a well-coordinated team. But now, here's the question. What happens when blood pressure gets too high? Does the body just let the RAAS system run wild?
Right, good point. It can't just be a one-way street.
Of course not. The body has its own checks and balances, remember. And one of the key players on the other side of the equation is atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP.
ANP. That sounds kind of familiar. Is it related to those atrial reflexes we talked about earlier?
You got it. ANP is released by the atria of the heart, those upper chambers, and it's triggered by stretching. Basically, when blood volume is high, those chambers get filled with more blood than usual, and that causes them to stretch.
Ah, okay, so it's like the atria are sending out a signal saying, hey, we're a bit overloaded here.
Exactly. And ANP acts like a counterbalance to the RAAS. It basically tells the kidneys to get rid of more salt and water, which then decreases blood volume and helps lower blood pressure.
So it's like a constant tug of war between these two forces. RAAS is pulling to raise blood pressure, and ANP is pulling to lower it.
That's a perfect analogy. And it's that intricate interplay that allows the body to maintain that healthy balance.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it, all these different systems working behind the scenes to keep everything running smoothly.
It really is. It really highlights how complex and efficient the human body is.
Okay, so we've covered the sprinters, the middle distance runners, and now the marathon runners of blood pressure control. You mentioned vasopressin a minute ago, though, and I'm really curious to learn more about its specific role in all of this.
Vasopressin, oh yeah, it's a fascinating hormone. It plays a dual role in blood pressure regulation, actually. It can act super quickly in those emergency situations, but it also has these important long-term effects as well.
Okay, well, let's dive into that then. I'm ready to hear more. So right before the break, we were starting to get into this idea that vasopressin, or ADH, is like a real multitasker when it comes to regulating blood pressure.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's got its hands in a lot of different processes.
Can you remind us, like, how does vasopressin work when it comes to regulating water balance in the body?
Well, think about it this way. When you're dehydrated, your body really needs to conserve water, right? So vasopressin steps in and signals to the kidneys, basically telling them to reabsorb more water back into the bloodstream. And that means less water gets lost through urine, which helps maintain blood volume. And of course, blood volume is really important for maintaining healthy blood pressure.
Right, right. So that's the long game. That's the marathon runner aspect of vasopressin. But you were saying it also plays a role in those short-term emergency situations.
Exactly. When there's a sudden drop in blood pressure, like if someone loses a lot of blood, vasopressin kind of has this hidden talent.
Okay.
It can act as a really rapid vasoconstrictor.
So it can like quickly narrow the blood vessels to bump up the pressure.
Yep, exactly. And sometimes it can actually be even more effective than angiotensin II when it comes to constricting blood vessels. It's really remarkable how quickly the body can adapt, to these different situations.
Yeah, it is. So vasopressin is like what? A multi-tool. It can be both that long distance runner and a sprinter when it comes to blood pressure control. I like that.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just about vasopressin acting alone. Remember how we were talking about angiotensin II earlier?
Yeah.
Well, angiotensin II can actually stimulate the release of vasopressin. So they kind of work together as a team to keep that blood pressure balanced.
It's amazing. It really is a beautifully orchestrated system, you know,
Right.
all these different players all working together. And this whole conversation about blood pressure, it really makes you realize how much we take our bodies for granted.
I know. It's so easy to forget about all these incredible processes that are happening inside of us every second of every day, keeping us alive and functioning.
Yeah.
But I think, understanding these systems even a little bit,
Yeah,
it can really empower people to take better care of their health.
for sure, for sure. So, like, thinking about everything we've talked about today, what would you say are some of the key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think one of the most important things to remember is that lifestyle really does matter. Chronic stress, for example, can actually lead to prolonged activation of that fight or flight response, and that can throw off the balance of all these delicate systems.
Yeah, like we were talking about before with the baroreceptors, how they can get less sensitive over time.
Exactly. And if that fight or flight response is constantly getting triggered, it can actually contribute to high blood pressure over time.
Wow. Okay. So it's not just about genetics or age. Our everyday choices really can have a big impact on our cardiovascular health.
Absolutely. But the good news is there's a lot we can do to support our body's natural ability to regulate blood pressure. Managing stress, eating a healthy diet, getting regular exercise, all of these things can make a real difference.
Such good advice. Well, this has been an absolutely incredible journey exploring the world of blood pressure regulation. I feel like I've learned so much today. Do you have any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
I would just encourage everyone to keep learning and exploring. Maybe do some research on specific conditions like hypertension or hypotension, and think about how the things we talked about today, those long-term regulatory mechanisms, how different lifestyle choices might impact those systems. The more we understand how our bodies work, the better equipped we are to make informed decisions about our health.
Couldn't agree more. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of blood pressure regulation. Until next time, folks, keep those systems balanced.